My name is Paul Betts. I'm the director of the European Studies Center here. It's a kind of a nice way to begin a half day of celebrations, our 40th anniversary event this day. We decided to do things a little bit experimentally this time in terms of integrating student voices in terms of the state of European studies today. And you're young enough, probably it's a little harder for you to think about how these things have changed over the decades, but we thought I'd give you a chance at least to talk about how these things have evolved with time. Now, it's a very fitting thing to do both in the center and this college. This college, of course, founded in 1950 with the idea of trying to break what was seen as a kind of Anglocentrism in terms of the syllabus across most of the colleges, dedicated to kind of more of a well-rounded education. But the particular strategy they developed here was, in a sense, the foundation of a range of regional studies centers. This one, of course, was founded in 1976. First one was the Russian Eastern European Studies Center. Part of the reason why this was known as the West European Studies Center up till 1990 was to distinguish it from the Russian Eastern European Studies Center. But the idea of, in a sense, building a kind of community of scholars and students around a regional focus was, in a sense, became a kind of profile issue of this college in particular. So that's not to say that's fundamentally new. There's a long history of that in this country. You think, for example, of C.E. Watson setting up C's in the 1920s in the idea of studying the Balkans, for example, as a kind of dangerous region after the First World War. So it's kind of a long history of regional specialization. This college in particular kind of took the lead in the 1950s and 60s in this idea of looking toward kind of global interaction, using the studies centers as a way of engaging with people across the college and across the university. So what we decided to do, in a sense, is invite three panelists to, in a sense, discuss this particular issue more broadly, how European studies has been understood for your generation, how you think it might be changing. So let's go ahead and introduce the panelists, if that's okay. I'll start actually with Olivier Santin, who's the president of the European Affairs Society. He wanted, in a sense, just have a quick opening statement about the relationship between the EAS and the center. If you don't mind just saying a few words about what you've done and what you hope to continue to achieve in the future.
Yep. Thank you, Paul. Just a few words. So I'm not an EPS student. I'm studying public policy here. As Paul said, I'm president of the European Affairs Society. The society has been existing for 25 years. It was founded in 91. It has had its ups and downs. There are many societies in Oxford. One thing I would like to stress is that societies, generally what they do is organizing events, having people join around a topic, which we have been doing quite successfully these last 2 terms. We've been organizing 3-4 events per term. It was really, really interesting. But also part of our job is to fuel the relationship between the students and the professors. We have many students, many European students interested in Europe, Europeanization, European studies. And they study in different fields. They study in history, they study in politics, they study in public policies, like myself. And it's sometimes difficult in Oxford to be able to fuel that discussion with the professors. And that's really what we are trying to do as a society, to make it easier for students and for professors to just meet, talk, and entertain a fruitful discussion and relationship. Next year I won't be there. I'll leave to probably the EPS students, mostly the society. And I think that one thing I want everybody to keep in mind is this idea that half of our job is organizing events, and it's important, and half of our job is fueling that discussion, spending a lot of time with professors, and creating that interaction which is necessary. We are the generation which has to probably rebuild another notion, another idea of Europe, and there's a lot we have to learn from the past, and there's a lot we have to shape for the future, and we won't be able to do it without all the knowledge you guys have, and we won't be able to do it with that interaction, which is really necessary. So I'm letting the Yara, Matteo and Martin talk today, and hopefully talk to you also during this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you very much. So I have going to give very, very brief introductions of all three speakers. We'll start with Martin Lausegger. The students all come from all different corners of Europe, which I think is actually quite fitting here. All of you are doing MPhils. Martin did his BSc in management at Warwick. He's doing MPhil European Politics and Society here. He's interested in the interface of business and politics, and he's looking at the elections, impacted elections on financial markets. Second speaker, Matteo Brunelli, who's a first-year MPhil, who's doing a thesis on European foreign policy, and his interest in kind of U.S. foreign policy, transatlantic relations, Italian politics, and history of European immigration. And finally, Jaroslava Barbieri, who's half Italian, half Ukrainian, also an MPhil student, editor-in-chief of Politicon, which is the academic journal of the International Association of Political Science Students. She's interested in working on European foreign policy and enlargement, Russian foreign policy, and post-Soviet democratization and conflict transformation. So we thought we'd do, since each one of you have about 2 minutes or so to kind of to lay out some general thoughts, have a couple questions in which we'll then integrate the audience, and we'll kind of see how we go from there. So we've got about an hour or so we'll start with you then, Martin, please.
You said you want to start?
Or do you want to
The
start?
story, yeah.
Well, I mean, I can
Okay.
start. Thank you, Paul.
Okay.
Thank you for your kind introduction, for inviting us to speak here today. And I just hope we're not the contemporary reflection of the students that were doing Sovietology in 1988, in some sense. But there's just 3 broad points I want to stress overall in this very brief introduction. So first of all, I think that what we sometimes lose track of is that European studies is not necessarily EU studies, which in our masters the distinction seems kind of blurred often. For example, it's about the continent of which the boundaries are unclear. It's an interdisciplinary subject. The best studies include sociology, political science, economics, international relations. The territorial focus is narrow, so I think the multidisciplinarity needs to be high in some sense. And the EU itself remains to a large extent, I think, an institutional study. Hence the importance of concepts, multi-level governance, spillovers, intergovernmental, relationships as well. And there's other important institutions in Europe, such as NATO, which in many Eastern European countries is considered as important as the EU, if not sometimes even more important than the EU. Often I think that's not spoken about enough, maybe, in our courses and maybe in others as well. My second broad point I would like to bring is maybe a weakness of European studies, and it kind of impacts one of the themes I think Paul wanted to talk about in the sense of an inherent anti-nationalist bias within the discipline. It seems that an underlying assumptions of many books and articles on the topic is that European integration is always a good thing, and if it's done well, and nationalism is this bad thing coming from World War II, World War I, and as a self-confessed federalist, yes, there still are some of us young people that are like that. I would definitely put myself in that crowd. But the problem is, I think it causes a bit of a blind spot, because we see now that the big trend of these recent years, and probably the next 5 years, is this growing nationalism again in Europe and across the Western world. And so, because of these biases, maybe we've been blind to it. And the whole Brexit debate, I think a lot of we've been caught blind by that to some extent. And my last point. Maybe some point of the future of European studies. I mean, does European studies? It's been intrinsically linked to the empirical developments of the EU to a certain extent. There's a very close relationship between professors and policymakers. I think throughout since the 40s and 50s, and so is the future of European studies? Do we need to become a discipline kind of like the EU, mired in conflict and deadlock with almost unsurmountable problems, it seems, or should we actually, or do we have a role in promoting some type of European renewal? As I think Olivier also mentioned. I mean, I started studying in my university in 2012, and so basically my university experience studying the EU has been constant talks on Eurozone crisis, rise of far-right parties, and increasingly migration crisis. I mean, and the whole the nice period of the 90s and 2000s when integration was going well is kind of, I mean, I've never had that experience of studying it to a certain extent, and so. But I do think that, European studies can have an impact in some type of renewal of the European project. We need to be the ones, I mean, if we're not the ones that are coming up with new ideas, we can't expect the politicians to do that necessarily with all their, other duties as well. And so, I just want to end with this, and thank you again for...
Mark.
Yeah, then I continue. We have heard a little bit about the past of European studies, and I'll focus more about the upcoming research areas and the research puzzles that European studies scholars are facing. And there's two big kind of gaps that I try to identify. The first one is that we have to understand where is European integration heading towards to. And the second one is that I would like to mention is that the democratic deficit that the European Union still faces. To start off with the first one, I do believe that we are at a kind of disequilibrium regarding European integration, especially since the beginning of the Eurozone crisis and the financial crisis. We've seen that there is, on the one hand, more shift towards further integration, but on the other hand, there's a counter-balance movement back, which fosters further disintegration. Looking at European integration, we can see that this crisis really created new political opportunities to learn of the mistakes that we did in the past and integrate further. We got opportunity to grow closer together within those different nations that are there. We've seen that there's new instruments that got implemented during the financial crisis. We have now a European stabilization mechanism with more than 1 trillion euros in there, which can act as a kind of fiscal transfer equivalent instrument. We have seen the development of the outright monetary transaction program created by the ECB to buy bonds from the markets. Further integration happens there as well. We've seen the development of a European banking union. In all those areas, Europe really grows now closer together. At the same time, despite this kind of criticism constantly, we have still seen that the euro area increased in areas. We have seen Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania joining the currency area, despite the struggles that we are facing. All of that really could be kind of put together as well as this puzzle of international redistribution, right? That on the one hand, we don't have direct fiscal transfers, but we will still have this kind of bailout programs, for example, as we have seen with Greece. Having talked now a bit about integration, we really see the counterbalance to that is disintegration. We've seen, as Matteo already mentioned, there's a rise in nationalism across Europe. The Front National in France, the FPÖ in Austria had quite a successful election campaign over the last couple of weeks. The AfD in Germany, the UKIP here in Britain. All of that really revives the nationalism that has already, with which this continent already had experience with. And to that comes the rhetoric of the politicians, which gets more emotional and stronger. And what this could lead into is a kind of vicious circle of anti-integration sentiment and anti-integration public opinions of the people. And all of that could really disunite Europe as we know it today. And so this is like summing up to this first point is really that we are moving into more integration on the one hand, but we have disintegration factors on the other hand, and scholars in the future will have to figure out where we actually stand now. There's the first topic. And the second topic I would briefly just touch upon is the one of democratic deficit. And that is one of the big questions that we face right now. It's the relationship between the market and democracy within Europe. Very often nowadays, decisions are based on the market and no longer on what the voters actually want to have. We have seen that incoming governments across a lot of countries, whether that's Greece or Ireland, had no choice but to kind of continue with the policies that the people did before them, such as we have seen Cyprus last summer. We also have seen that European democracies really depend on the support of organized interests. We've seen organized interests got created in a lot of countries, but the problem was that those interest groups, they never got their way through, right? They were demanding certain policies, they were demanding certain interests, but they never got fulfilled. And that leaves us with a democratic deficit, which the scholars really should explore in future. And perhaps with a concluding sentence of a believer in the European idea, those are two research areas that are waiting ahead of us. And I think today we're celebrating kind of 40 years of ESC. I do believe that we are having more than 400 years of ESC Study Center waiting ahead of us. And with that, I wish a happy birthday to the ESC community here.
All right, thank you very much. Jaroslava.
Thanks for being here. I have 2 points to the question, why are European studies so important today? The first one I thought was sort of the theoretical potential of this field, and the second one deals with the object of European studies itself, the EU. So, as for the first point, I think that European studies have a unique capacity to reinvent the analytical tools that it's dealing with when we're studying political science. Because if we're studying the history of European integration and enlargement, we can see that, you know, question of sovereignty, of borders, of authority have completely shifted back and forth. And this is, I think, that is something that European studies could teach and inspire and inform other disciplines within the broader political science environment. And my thesis is on analyzing European and Russian foreign policy towards the common neighborhood from 1991 up to now, and I'm basically seeing how certain conception of borders are inherent to these foreign policy, but that have been remained implicit. And so I think that if we really dig down into these processes of integration and enlargement, we can see that some key analytical tools that we somehow perceive as given object of analysis might be much more questionable and not as given as we assume. And so this is, I think, something that European studies, the way it reinvents itself. For instance, you mentioned the biases within the discipline itself, but I think, for instance, very recent literature on disintegration theories, it's from authors who said, well, it's very good to know the ground theories of integration, but we really need to come up with new alternative analytical tools to address questions such as Brexit, such as, you know, regional movements that might, you know, discard our idea of the nation state, or you know, the current diatribes between the Commission and Poland. And so it is, you know, post-Soviet democratization such a irreversible process? Maybe not. So that would be my first point. And the second point is about the EU itself. As Paul mentioned, I'm half Italian, half Ukrainian, and also a bit Polish. So I was raised with sort of a strong self-awareness of different historical experience in different corners of Europe. And so from this perspective, I've always had this sort of schizophrenia because, you know, studying the history of Western European integration after 1945, etc., it's different from when I listened to my grandmother explaining what was the historical experience after 1945 there. And so, you know, when there was the Euromaidan in Ukraine, I was there with all my friends and seeing people that out of the blue, each of them was, you know, minding their own business, that out of the blue becomes a national liberation movement, and people speaking Russian, Ukrainian, all social classes, all generations were there and having in their mouth the words Ukraine and Europe. And that is something striking that you wouldn't expect. And so then I come back here and I am surrounded by these intellectual talks on, you know, how the EU curtails national sovereignty. And so this is the schizophrenia that I'm having in terms of really trying to understand from different perspectives what the EU can mean today and European studies on this. So, you know, I think that from this perspective, the metaphor of, you know, the EU is fine as long as it keeps cycling is actually not accurate anymore, because given the you know, the rising revisionist Russia, given the migrants crisis, we're just all smashing one car, and it's not a cycling promenade, it's like a car crash test, and we're all there. And so I think that this European studies could be, or if we come up with some political economic airbags, at least the intellectual airbag that we have, you know.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm just going to pick up on two small points, and I'm just going to open up for general discussion. I think just from what Matteo and Jaroslava just said at the very end, I mean, there are other issues that we can talk about later, but it's really in a sense about what seems to be the kind of built-in conceptual bias of the field of European studies. One is that it's designed, you're in a program called European Politics and Society. The and society is the idea is supposed to be a broader sense, maybe not necessarily even elitist kind of introduction of, or the integration of society, culture, a kind of well-rounded view of Europe. But for the most part, it's been designed as an effort to overcome what they felt to be the nationalist bias of a range of kind of nation-state stories. that, and you say a kind of moment in which it seems to be a kind of rising nationalism that European studies doesn't seem to be all that well equipped to in a sense, deal with that problem. But you're also saying about the importance of integration, because again, these fields are developing in the 1960s where you have an integration in the West and in the East, different sort of models, in which it seemed that nationalism, issues of religion, it's all these things that somehow been repressed. It's a story about integration. So integration and a kind of anti-nationalist bias were at the very, very heart of European studies, and at least in the way it was conceived in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The question is now, what you're almost calling for is a kind of new theories of disintegration. That can we somehow move European studies into a different conceptual field that can acknowledge the new problems? So I guess it's a question of if you want to just take that right now, or I mean, you've said a few things. I was just open up in terms of, are we at a moment in which European studies as a field needs to be rethought in terms of has this particular bias, it's been ticking along, we say kind of cycling along for a very long time, is it now, have we reached a moment in which we have to think a little harder about what European studies is designed to do in terms of what it is we want to know? Because it could be that issues of religion, nationalism, and disintegration don't really kind of fall under the remit of what we classically understood as European studies. Do you feel that there's a kind of, it's not necessarily a crisis in the field, but there's a way in which European studies is bumped up against a limit in terms of what we can actually understand? How do we integrate these other factors into what we understand as European studies? I think that's what at least two of you are kind of getting at. I mean, that seems like a very interesting question in terms of there's a kind of transitional moment in terms of the field of European studies. What are we trying to do? I mean, what is it we want to know? Right? It's not clear. It's not the same as it was 30 years ago. In the sense, the kind of rug's been pulled out from other ppolitical worlds. The question is, do we have the intellectual equipment with which to approach these problems? You know, what you're talking about disintegration. Yeah, please.
For instance, we're looking at past exam questions now, and one of the questions is functionalism still relevant in the sense that you can't come up with new analytical tools if you don't know the previous one. But at the same time, this is what I meant by European studies being capable of reinventing the analytical tools. That they sort of, I agree that there's a sort of anti-nationalist bias, but up to a point, because even these grand theories, they didn't have a sort of teleological bias. The integration is going to keep going forward until there's going to be a globe of peace. No, I mean the concept spillover, the idea that every single policy that is entrenched in this idea of nation state and sovereignty still has to be bargained. I mean, it's more complicated. I think that these integration theories, literature, is just about saying, good, we have the analytical tools from grand integration theories, but we need to just make them more flexible in order to be capable to address unexpected phenomena such as Brexit, and then, okay, depending on the result of Brexit, there might be, implication for the UK structure, because if Scotland decide, well, it's an English exit, not already a Brexit. So, I'm saying it's not that we discard the whole previous analytical tools, it's just that they need to be sort of shaken up a little bit.
Okay, European Studies 2.0 and something. I mean, I was kind of curious. So again, I'm coming from a perspective of the discipline of history. It might sound very different from those of you sitting in the room from IR, or social policy, or politics, economics. I mean, do you feel that European Studies has the capacity to absorb all these questions you're talking about as a kind of more flexible version of what we've been doing for essentially 2 generations? Or does it seem to the point we need to think a little harder about what European Studies is today? That's in a sense the question. Yeah. So please.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. First of all, great to hear you, and it's really great that students at whatever stage of your studies do and think in the way you do is not in a passive way, well, what do we like, not like about EU studies, but what should we change, what can we contribute, and also, as Matteo was starting right from the beginning, should we relate to the real world, so that you have a kind of actor-oriented, not just passive consumer of knowledge, and I guess that's the first key, I think, to this conversation, because of course we're the old hats, and in our generation, well, I'm speak right. Only for me, not my colleagues, but we tend to reproduce stuff, and you always need just provocative new thinking. I would say though, in this conversation about how much resource do we have in existing EU studies to evolve. I like to use this term transformative fidelity about the EU itself, that we need to be faithful to the original vision, but transform it in radical ways at the same time. So it's a bit of an oxymoron, but it does have meaning. And I think it applies in a way to EU studies too. And a lot of what you're saying speak to this, because the world has changed and the capacity of the EU to respond to it has changed. And Martin was bringing up the role of markets. I mean, this is so important. And market was an object of EU studies in all our decades. How do we create the single market, make it so that governments do not impede the single market? Now markets are actors of integration, either to further it, if they financial, or to create huge problems for integration, right? So that whole area is a whole new thing. And the fact that all this is happening, on the web, and this is very modern, postmodern stuff that you guys will be very well placed to understand. But I would say that it might help in our conversation to really distinguish between three levels. One is descriptive, which is simply, how do we understand this animal? Is it really true? As you were mostly implying that it was, and Paul was reflecting that the EU versus nations. And here we want to distinguish between nations and nationalism, or the perversion of the idea of the nation. Millward, after all, wrote, the EU as the rescue of the nation state, meant a long time ago. A member state wants to be rescued by the EU. And a lot of EU studies recognize it. So there's the description, and it's a bit all over the place. And then there is the causal stuff, can we explain and predict, what does, the theory doesn't help us, you're right, in predicting or analyzing the why, because on either it's functionalist, which is centralizing, or it's the whole new thing about disintegration, like good old empires, etc. And I think we need to really rethink, you were talking about equilibrium, that the notion of equilibrium and disequilibrium in the way you say. And finally, I would encourage us and you to not shy away from the normative, what should be, what ought to be. And that's, I think, a great lacuna of EU studies. It's always either descriptive or the why, explanatory factors, very little normative, which belong to philosophers somehow. So we need to really, and try to see how all these levels are linked, and your remarks were very much in these various directions. And at the end of the day, as Matteo raised right from the beginning, to think about the connection between us as scholars and us as citizens. What is the political impact and responsibility even of EU study? Because we are in the thing we're studying, and maybe that's a bit the difference with historians. As political scientists at least, and maybe as lawyers, we're both studying something, but we're part of it too. And so I do believe there is a responsibility there, at least for those who want to take it, and that's what I hear too.
Great. I see a number of professors already with their hands in the air. I really want to make this kind of as a student. Can we just get another student in terms of generational perspective on some of the things that we come from a different generation perspective in terms of having seen the European studies as a field evolve. But how does it look to you in terms of what you think it's offering or not offering? Olivier, you would come in.
Yeah, so what I understand is that European Studies Centers were created mostly after the Second World War under the impulsion of the European Union through the Center of European Culture, which was headed by the Swiss philosopher Didier de Rougemont, and they created, Alexandre Marc created Institut d'études européennes in Nice, Roger Aron went to develop Collège de Bruges, and they had all that network, but they were federalists, and they had a vision of Europe, and they were pushing their vision of Europe. That sort of disintegrated. We now have the European here, which is led by Paul Clare, who's trying to, as much as possible, connect all the universities around Europe, but there isn't so much it doesn't seem to be that there is so much of a push as after the Second World War. And so the question for me is, who today is, from political perspective, who today is leading and who today is pushing European politics, and in which direction? I don't have the answer, but I think it's an interesting perspective to look at. Is anyone leading? Where are those people? And what do they think, and in which direction are they bringing us?
Which would be another way of saying that post-war generation were much more internationalist than we are today, for whatever reason. That was very much on their agendas in terms of building those networks, and those networks have seemingly faded, or you don't have quite the the kind of intellectual energy around building those critical networks. Though we live in a much more kind of connected online world in which those connections are easier to make, the intellectual vision that goes with it is not as strong as I think it was in the 1950s and 60s for whatever reasons. I thought just go ahead and leave that. But we have any other students that want to just kind of pop in? Yes.
Can I jump in
sure.
on this intergenerational point? And actually also Calypso was talking about how we approach studies and how we institutionalize approaches to European studies, because the paradox, I think, is that a lot of the widespread assumption and consensus that our generation is the pro-European one, well, some support Lacan, fine, but we are the generation that would never question the existence of the EU, right? But at the same time, I think there's a paradox, because we're also perhaps the last generation that still will have people in the family that will tell them what World War II was, and so a sort of connection with the historical experience that led, and as you said, that sort of created this whole intellectual platform for the European project to just be launched. Whereas, for next generation, perhaps the existence of the EU might not be so, it might be just there, but, I just happen to have it, but the justification for it to be there might be less fragile. And so I think that there's also a problem of how European studies are being institutionalized within, secondary schools and higher education, because also we perceive ourselves a little bit as the black sheep in the DPIR, because we're these strange people doing these interdisciplinary things, and studying an object that might not be there tomorrow, or has not always been there. So no, but like this is something that made me think, in the sense, we should be careful with this idea that the justification for our object of study is always going to be there, and we're just this transitional generation of people who still remember and have people telling them why the EU was created, what was the value in it, and I'm not sure, like 10 years from now, whether this justification might be even less fragile.
Okay, do you want to pop in, Martin? Yeah, please.
Yeah, just to what you just said at the very end, this interdisciplinary understanding, I think that's like the great contribution of European studies, is really that it equips us scholars with a holistic view of certain things that happen, right? If you look at the Ukraine conflict, we will be aware that there's different dimensions that we can look at it. We can say, okay, there's a historic dimension of the kind of identities and the narratives that were created between these two countries. We can see there's an economic dimension, because the conflict was hugely also about the economic tensions between the European Union, Ukraine, and Russia. But we can also say, and take more on us the IR lens, right? And say, okay, it's actually all about military power and power dynamics. And I think that's really the key, contribution that this study really gives us, that we're not just narrowly minded IR people focusing on the IR dimension of a certain conflict, but that we kind of have the skill and the opportunity to really get it all in, all those different perspectives, and then try to understand what is the right thing to do.
Go ahead, please.
Very short, and then I'll let everybody else jump in. I mean, I just still think, already the conversation is going, we're, European studies, EU, European studies. I think we need to break subtly through that, because it's not just that. I mean, the focus of European studies is Europe, and should be Europe, and maybe the EU is not, will modify and change in ways, it was European communities, it was the European Council community before. I mean, it can change, and there's a lot of other factors. I mean, maybe NATO in the future, under President Trump, will become an only European alliance. I mean, who knows? if it won't disintegrate. So I mean, and then how will that be incorporated? Or the European Court of Human Rights, that's not under the EU. Now the EU is a member of it, but there's a lot of other factors, and I think the intra-state dynamics of the whole projects. I mean, that's also important, because I think if we just focus on an institution, then the whole society part of European politics and society also gets lost to a certain extent. I mean, despite the best attempts of constructivists, they haven't really been able to prove that there is that much of a society within the Commission and these institutions. I mean, they do, but it's not the same thing. It doesn't have music and in some sense. So I don't know. I just feel like that's also important, because ultimately the foundation upon which a stable political structure must be based on is not, is definitely not the EU today, and not foreseeably. So I think we need to really widen our focus and kind of break through the duopoly.
Very good. Let's get Anne Dyden, please.
Yeah, I think Calypso's got a category problem, because European studies is not EU studies. And this is absolutely core, and I can't disagree with her more profoundly than I'm about to say that it should be a normative project. I think that that is not the job of universities, it's not the job of scholarship. And what the European studies in Oxford at least tried to do, and I have to say we had exactly this debate with Ralph Darendorf in the 90s when we were setting up these European programs. Is it a real topic by itself? And what we've tried to create in Oxford is something that is genuinely interdisciplinary and builds upon the initial exercises in graduate work in European studies which came from departments of economics. It was nothing to do with politics. And there was a trope then that European integration is really about economics. It's all economics and you can figure it out if you get the maths right. And we've moved on from there. But it got very politicised, partly by the Commission, with the Jean Monnet posts and the Erasmus and early exchange programmes. And I actually think it's quite a dangerous place to be. It's very nice to have the money, but it's a dangerous place to be. And what Oxford and many other universities have tried to do is to create something that is interdisciplinary but not federalist. I think you're absolutely right, sir. I don't know your name, but I think you're absolutely spot on about the federalist impulse going through some of these centres. I think the interesting thing is that it's not just EPS, European Politics and Society, but it's actually IR also that is in a complete identity crisis. And I would like to hear from the students whether it isn't the case that these sort of new quasi-disciplines aren't in crisis because we're in crisis as a society. We're very happy to say of historians, I'm an international historian, a social historian, a historian of East Germany, and that's okay, but that is partial. In the same way that the study of Europe tries to be a little bit more inclusive. So we use different standards for different kinds of disciplines. And I think the most serious challenge is the overlap between domestic politics and international relations. And in the end, the Department of Politics will either have to collapse or absorb both sides of this question. You cannot study IR without understanding domestic politics. And those courses that still run in Oxford that try to study government of one country without touching foreign policy, and I have to say the UK option does exactly that. And nonsense, complete nonsense, really. They do not give a good picture. I think that makes places like this very important, Paul, because what you can do here is to draw a huge variety of different kinds of scholarship, you know, whether it's scholarship on Spain or Italy or the Basque Country or France, and mix it up with these skill sets that our young researchers are acquiring. So I think that we need places like this to top up the main. Come on, Paul, we're talking about you. In you come. There we are. And that was all planned, by the way. And we need the European as well, as I was just about to say.
Great, and any student like to respond to that in terms of what she's talking about, identity crisis for these particular fields? I mean, I know you're MPhil students, it may be a little hard for you to get some distance on what in fact you're just having a hard time enough studying to think reflecting on, but if you have just kind of any preliminary thoughts about how you understand it when you talk to your peers about, or maybe other universities that are also doing kind of European studies related courses, does it seem to be a different one? You get the feeling it's answering the questions that mean most to you?
Well, I mean, I did my background in international relations, and definitely, I mean, if in a field the first course you do in the field is what exactly are you studying, because nobody really knows, and there's a big amount of debate on it. I mean, I would agree with Anne on this for sure. I mean, at least I was at the LSE, so it's a different institution.
I hope you were told by me.
Yeah.
They can disagree with their professors.
Yeah.
Public.
Well,
I would disagree with most of
I mean, yes. No, but in a sense that there is, I mean, personally I thought that there was a sense of, everybody, there's no longer a sense of, this is the field that we're doing. And, there's kind of everybody's kind of off doing their own sub things. And it's kind of been lost, or I don't know if there ever was, but, I wasn't there to see it. The broader, the people actually talking together and having, what is our discipline talk. I mean, there's people publishing articles on it, but I feel like the majority of people kind of ignore it, even academics, and they're off doing, in IR, there's people that do everything from, international political economy to human rights. Well, they actually need to talk to each other. But, the point is, it often seemed that there wasn't, even within a single department of just IR. I mean, I could definitely see that there, and, I could definitely see it to a certain extent in our department, where we need to have special permission to take courses in international relations, even though, Calypso is offering a course on European crisis, which we are able to take, but just the fact that you need to go through a different process to get special permission to do it in the same department for things that, should be, it is kind of a symptomatic of the problem.
Yes, please complain about that.
Okay, you want to pop in, please?
I think this is crucial because the crisis within the disciplines themselves, I think it comes from how we institutionalize disciplines within higher education institutions. That's the major problem. So if you really create departments that, are fragmented, so like you do comparative government, you do European studies, and you do IR, and the access the student have to, develop that knowledge, it is going to be fragmented because of how it's institutionalized. It's it's like there's a past dependency of bad habits accumulated, and so I think that the crisis within disciplines themselves. That I agree. I take the IR crisis in my own thesis because I think that all the major lenses through which the conflict in Eastern Europe has been approached, that it's just too partial. So this is like my take on this, but I think that the major problem is just that have people super specialize in something, but then it's really up to us to go and talk to these people specializing in something else, because how institutions, higher education institutions are built, it's just basically IR people talking among IR people and ComGov people among ComGov people, and so we're these black sheep trying to to defend our spots. But this is a problem of how institutionalization creates these crises.
So that flexibility you were calling for at the very beginning, it's not there institutionally in terms of that flexibility. It needs a lot more.
The center is good for that.
Okay. Often you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, the discussion has progressed. What I wanted to say, which is also very personal, I mean, I think that EU is too much kind of tied to European politics, and that's a big problem, because for us, for comparative politics, it's a frustration when we want to study European politics, because Europeanization and the EU is always in the way. I mean, even the Balkans, for instance, an example in my area, we always understand domestic politics of the Balkans through the EU prism. What needs to be done, what kind of political systems you need to have there, what is transition. And that, I think, really has affected, like a EU perspective, the kind of understanding of European politics. So I believe that we should go back to the national space as well. We need to give space to the national politics, to be able to understand them a bit more. Because when we see them actually reacting to the EU, we feel that they are a threat, a danger. The referendum is a threat for the EU. And what I would like to ask you, because obviously, you are able, due to your younger age, to have a different understanding of things. Are you able to engage, better and more constructively with the alternative voice? Because obviously now that we've got alternative understandings of European politics. And I was just wondering, are you able to kind of engage and relate to these different voices? Because when we think of them, we kind of make those kind of not very useful dichotomies, like populism versus cosmopolitanism, or but there's something deeper than this, and there is a reaction for a reason. And I was just wondering whether you can engage with the reaction as well, more effectively than we can.
Anybody want to take that, or do you want to preferably open up for other questions?
Just two very brief things just on that. So when you're talking about the dichotomy, the other, are we talking about, for example, in this country, people that are, kind of pro-Brexit and for Brexit to some extent, kind of to summarize, kind of the dichotomy, people that, kind of focus more national or more on European level?
Yeah, I think that, the distinctions between the Europhile, Eurosceptic are not useful anymore.
Communitarians,
or the understanding populism, the alternative kind of, that is not useful either. And I'm just wondering whether you have the capacity to deal better with this kind of alternative voice, which is developing, both in the in the academic world, the scholarly community, as well as in the in the practical world.
I mean, to a certain extent, because I think a lot of the problem is that a lot of these voices, because have also fundamental anti-establishment, kind of an intrinsic anti-establishment ideology within it, so they kind of shy away from we're all here doing MPhils or DPhils or teaching at university, so we are part of the establishment to a certain extent. And so I think unfortunately, a lot of these voices, at least on an academic club, you don't really deal with it. Even among students, there aren't that many students. I think that, especially St. Anthony's College is extremely cosmopolitan. So the opportunity of dealing with these alternative voices. I mean, when you travel, when you go around Europe, when I go back home to Italy, they are there, but they're not. Unfortunately, you don't have. It's not like you're sitting down and having a more of a rap. It's more like talking around a table at a bar. You're not really having a chance of, okay, let's actually study this issue to a certain extent. What do that's not happened, at least in my personal experience.
Can I just add the thing? Am I wrong when I'm saying that we don't have enough perspective on contemporary European intellectual thinking to be able to understand the extent to which all the knowledge which has been developed these last 50 years was political or not, and to what extent it was political oriented and leaning towards one direction. So going back to what Anne was saying, I'm not in their program, so maybe I'm too far apart from it, but I have the thing that we haven't done that work yet of going back to what has been produced these last 50 years and look at it from a political perspective and explain it to us to be able to digest it correctly.
And that may be the next wave. I mean, there's been just recently where historians, for example, circle back to the history of human rights in a way that had been left to political scientists, IR theorists from generations. And that, in a sense, has sparked a very different rereading of the kind of origins of human rights discourse, whether the interwar years of the 1950s. And it may be the same, where a range of historians will circle back in terms of talking about the history of European integration. It gives an historical perspective on a lot of these broader problems. But let me just ask a question about regional integration. I mean, one of the dreams, of course, after 1989 would be this idea that we start to study Europe across the old Cold War divide in terms of an integration East and West and a better integration of North and South. Do you think that has happened for you? It doesn't necessarily have to just speak about Oxford experience, but other people at European studies programs, or the kinds of things you're reading. And does it seem to be that there's an effort to think about the continent as a continent, or does it still end up being where it's essentially cut into regions? Germany, France, Italy, the kind of classic Western European core still sit at the center. The rest are so-called peripheral studies. Eastern European histories or politics was kind of an interest in the 1990s. That has dropped away. Do you feel for your generation that sense of thinking about Europe as a whole is growing in importance? Do you feel that that's or not? Because it's very interesting from my perspective. I have my own views, but I'm just wondering how you read this. Yeah.
I mean, the fact that there is still a journal of West European politics focusing on West European countries really clearly says that for some of us, it's slowly coming there that Europe is one thing and that it's no longer divided, but there's still strong institutionalized differences between the West and the East. And also, when you talk to people, you very often, when there's people from Central European countries, they always get referred to as Eastern European people. And I think there is still, it's still in our heads that there is a West and the East. But I also think that there is a progress coming ahead, which slowly kind of shifts this away and tries to unify that. But one last point perhaps is that I believe that this has brought us really great opportunities to do research as well. This kind of the fall of the Iron Curtain has created this kind of natural experiment and has been picked up by scholars from different disciplines who try to analyze the different kind of institutional mechanisms that created out of that.
You want to both pop in something, please?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting question because it has such an uneven response. I mean, to a certain extent, like in this center, I was, I wouldn't say disappointed is wrong, but I was surprised to the extent that you actually don't really talk about Germany, France, Italy, Spain that much. The whole lecture series. I mean, there actually is a big focus. I mean, and it's very good, on the Balkans, on Southeastern Europe, on Poland, and on Eastern Europe. If you just look at the lecture list for this center, That's very much a focus. And so definitely, I mean, at least in Oxford, I think there's been a big focus on that. Maybe even, not say too much, we should, but maybe there's been something lost of the Western Europe to some extent. But then again, when you read academic articles, on the other hand, it's, Germany, France, UK is very much often the thing. And also just the facts on, if the Western European Study Center and the, Russian Study Center, they're still separate. It'd be interesting with the idea of potentially combining them weapons for those institutions.
They changed names. It took us years to change the name of the Russian center that was East Europe. We fought for a long time about where does East Europe belong to, the Eurasian Center or the European Center. But we didn't envisage merging yet. Putin had come into power, so it was
But there is a focus on Russia, at the Russian East European studies.
But in theory, Russia's part of Europe.
European,
But not only, right? It is Central Asia as well.
But can I ask, just to continue a bit on the line of Paul, do you feel that there's an Oxford difference? And I mean, it's implicit in what, we come back to this, sometimes we seem to be talking about European studies in general, but there's this Oxford thing, which is, I mean, if we're all praising interdisciplinarity, cautiously, because we understand that in the world, if you want to get jobs in academia, we're still organized around disciplines, I would say, unfortunately. But in Oxford, at least, I would say, and I'd like to hear your opinion, that there's a real Oxford difference, that, historians, political scientists, and I would say also political philosophers who did think normatively and whom we incorporate in normative IR, I don't see why we shouldn't incorporate it in normative EU. All of us, as well as economists, are gathered in colleges. Moreover, there's regional science, so regional studies and comparative regional studies, which we try to do. So in all of these ways, my experience in spending 15 years at Harvard and now 17 years at Oxford is much more prone to doing European studies in an interdisciplinary way. Now, I don't want to be too self-congratulatory, although it is our birthday, as it were, so maybe it's okay. But I mean, it would be nice to, I think we all need to think a bit more about this Oxford difference in potential, because I'm not sure we use it well enough. But you've been elsewhere too, you have friends around Europe. And Matteo was just saying, well, maybe here at the European Center we go too much the other way in looking at the periphery and not enough at the core. So I think a kind of critique of Oxford would be interesting on this center.
I agree with the sort of separation that you've mentioned between what we see in the readings and the kind of topics that center could approach. But about this, going back to the West-East, back to historians, there's actually an amazing book by Larry Wolff. It's at Stanford, and he wrote this book, Inventing the Concept of Eastern Europe. So basically he traces the exchanges of letters between all the philosophers of the Enlightenment and Catherine the Great and Friedrich the Great. And so, Friedrich would write that Poland at that time, it's just this no one's land full of idiots whose names all end in ski. And so how much, and Voltaire wrote that Ukraine is like terre perdue, and so it's just incredible how, I'm a philosopher from my undergrad, did philosophy in my undergrad, so like how ideas shape our way of thinking in practical terms. I do believe that we should sort of study the history of ideas in that sense, but I'm not sure, because I do agree that interdisciplinary is important, but at the same time, we shouldn't, get lost too much in these cross-disciplinary moments and then lose the substance of that each discipline can give you in terms of substance and depth. And at the same time, I'm a big believer in area studies, because it's so frustrating when I understand a certain region and then I speak to people who focus on another region and they use the analytical tools that are relevant from their historical and political experience, and then think that they're relevant to another field in another area. But at the same time, I think that if different area studies, different centers, different disciplines do not talk among one another, then we end up being these intellectual clusters that are like these bubble like flowing in the academic sky, and there's and we then lose the potential of these institutions in actually creating these channels and of dialogue. So Oxford is unique in that sense. But again, it depends also how we're using this potential.
Maybe it's more unique for professors than for students. That would be a point I would make.
Because like I'm doing an MPhil as well, but I do see the value in doing regional studies. But the thing is that I think in our course, in the core European governance module that we've been doing, we're basically focusing on the EU and the institutions in Brussels and not really
Speak
doing
louder because I don't think people
Sorry.
in the back
that
hear.
we're focusing on the EU in Brussels and the institutions there, but we're not really doing like regional studies, like cross-country comparisons, what's happening at the national level. Because, for example, you say that we are saying that the populists are anti-establishment, but for example, what's happening in Austria, like this past week, like it's not like half Austrians became like anti-establishment. So we have a lack of understanding at the national level.
Can you speak up?
We cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying basically that we're within the framework of the EPS course, that we're focusing on the institutions rather than the countries, and I think that we have a gap in some of the regional countries.
Okay, I think we're going to have. Did you have a question in the back? Did you want to ask the last question? Because I think we're going to have to wrap it up. Yeah, sorry.
It's just a really quick comment. I just want to say I definitely agree that there definitely needs to be more study of sort of transnational currents that occur both across the West and East. But I do think that there is a real danger in trying to conflate the two because the histories of the two sides, as they are so different and the legacies are so different that I worry that if we try and study them as part of this broader European thing without recognising the very distinct, different political and historical currents within them, that we will miss opportunities in which to make perhaps the institutions of the EU or perhaps governments more broadly better. And I think we definitely see this in democratization, which is my field, where we see the application of democratic instruments across the entirety of Central and Eastern Europe, however you want to call it, that maybe isn't necessarily going to function the right way simply because we haven't recognized the differences there. So I think we have to balance these two sorts of currents in European studies. I think that's a real challenge.
Okay, the last question then. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I was wondering whether we should be considering the shifting nature of boundaries in the European Union, because we seem to be talking about a specific title, but the content is moving all the time. So at the end of the day, we have to maybe choose or maybe explain what we mean. Otherwise, we may all agree on something, but that something would have a different meaning for every one of us. So I find this as a point that I wanted to mention to you. And then two very brief comments, really brief ones. The first one is nationalism. Is here, well, I don't think it ever was away, has always been around, but nationalism has to be studied, because nationalism has at least two phases. One which is benign, it helps to the promotion of those peoples or countries that demand the respect for their own culture, for example. But it has another phase, which is the one that we associate with xenophobia, fascism, racism, and these things are different. If I come to you and I say I'm a nationalist, do you really know what kind of politics I'm going to be following? I don't think so, because it changes, and we have to insist on this, which I consider significant. It's important because obviously this is totally connected with the idea that nationalism does not define our policies. We have to spell out what we mean by it in every particular case. So nationalism is bad, but we need not to be afraid of facing it. It's just understand, and understanding a la Max Weber, I would say. When you understand is when you then can account and engage or project, but at least you've got this specific perspective.
Okay, good. I think it's going to call for more conceptual kind of sensitivity. A lot of terms we're using is also how do we integrate diversity and our kind of understanding of Europe as a continent. I think we're going to have to draw that to a close. I think it was actually, we don't spend enough time, it seems to me, reflecting on our disciplines in terms of the kind of knowledge production, what it is we're actually doing. So it's actually quite interesting. And thank you very much to the panels are all very, very impressive. It's not easy, I think, as MPhil students to think, going to step back and think about what the discipline's doing in terms of disciplining and punishing you on some level in terms of what you're asked to study or not. And I think you're all three of you gave very reflective comments.